super delighted to host another episode of the Embodiment podcast with our guest this week, Martin Aylward, who I've done quite a bit of work with last year on our embodied meditation training. And quick plug, it starts again next week. This year's iteration starts next week. And Martin's always been one of our most appreciated teachers, I think, certainly as far as meditation goes. He's been teaching with us for quite a few years. He's written a book, which is really great, Awake Where You Are. And he's particularly good at adapting principles of Buddhism and meditation to make them relevant to everyday life and people, whether you're a Buddhist or not. He also runs an amazing retreat center with his wife, Gail, in the south of France called the Moulin du Charme. And he's founder and teaches often at Sangha Live, which a lot of my friends really appreciate. A lot of my Buddhist friends love it. So check that out as well if you haven't already. And the other thing I was thinking of is that you're a proper practitioner. Like I remember from previous podcasts, you started really early going to India, wearing not much more than a loincloth, sitting in a hut with your teacher. And since then have done loads and loads of traveling, study, and clearly a lot of your own practice and running amazing retreats and courses. So a warm welcome back on the Embodiment podcast.
Nice. Thank you, Karin. Nice to see you, and very nice to hear the very glowing, warm words of welcome and appreciation.
Yeah. Well, it's really meant because we've met a lot on Zoom and once in person in a dark nightclub in Bhutan, unexpectedly. So we must have some karma that kind of keeps us crossing paths. And it's always a pleasure. So, yeah, you've just come back from the States. So if people haven't sort of heard you on the podcast before, we've asked Martin a lot about lots of different things, including his book. So you can go back, Google Embodiment Podcast, Martin Aylward. You can find previous episodes. But today I'm quite keen to check in with you, like what's going on in your work and your practice, and maybe diving a bit deeper into embodied meditation, which we tend to practice to go a bit deeper into our practice. So what have you been up to recently?
Well, rather than just give you some sort of potted history of my various activities, which might be interesting or might well not be interesting to people, I've been reflecting on what I could call, maybe sounds a little grandiose, but what I could call total practice. And that sense, it's like, and I think this is a good question for anybody to ask themselves, sort of repeatedly, what's the essence of your practice? Right. And this is what I ask myself, what's the essence of my practice? Because the form is important, right? So the form as a meditation practitioner, there's that form of just the sitting down, the crossing the legs, the sitting in a way that's both relaxed and dignified and upright, and just again and again, gently training the attention to be here, to be present, to be awake inside one's experience, and in that process to let things open up, and one becomes more and more familiar, not just with one's own psychological patterns and all of that, and one's reactivity and restlessness, but then increasingly familiar with the open space of mind, familiar with the way awareness can just gently hold and make room. So getting familiar not just with one's own stuff, but familiar with more the space around one's own stuff, familiar with the way awareness can just gently hold all the material that streams through. So that's one way of just describing one's formal practice. And it may be that people have formal movement practice. Maybe you do a particular Tai Chi form every morning or whatever, or you do a series of yoga postures or etc. But what's the essence of your practice? And that might have different forms. Why are you practicing? That initially you may have a straightforward answer, but ask yourself again, why am I practicing? Why am I practicing? And you just sort of get underneath the layers of that. And then, like I say, what's the essence? So for me, if I ask myself that question these days, what's the essence of practice? It's really about metabolizing every moment freely. And that's my interest, really, beyond the forms of meditation, beyond the particular frameworks that Buddhist teachings or other teachings hang on. It's this flavor of freeness. And that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the flavor of freeness that runs through every moment. Or I'm interested in, if that flavor of freeness isn't present, well, how come? What seems to be in the way? What delusion have I bought into that is giving me the impression that this moment isn't free? You know? And so that sense then that there's a kind of juicy sensory sort of intimacy with everything. Because in the beginning, we're sort of in love with the world, or we're seduced by the world, and we're pulled around by our own sensory engagement in the world. We're pulled around by what I want from the world and what I believe about the world and how I relate to other people and what I want from them and all of that stuff. And then maybe we discover, well, this is my history, and I discovered, that's all kind of tiring and intense, being pulled around by the world, and it gets me into trouble with my own agitation and complexity. And so then I undertook this whole sort of path of practice, which is in a way a sort of disengagement from the world. It's like, let's pull back from being endlessly just pulled around by what I see and what I hear and what I want and what I think and what I believe, and etc. And learning to develop a certain sort of independence from the world, a certain to be able to dwell in the open space of awareness rather than just being pulled around by everything that is flowing through awareness, if you like. And once that's sort of fairly established and one knows something about a taste of freeness, then it seems like the obvious response to that is to just let oneself completely fall in love with the world again. But it has a different flavor, right? One fall in love with the world without being seduced by it, or at least without being pulled around regardless of one's wishes. And therefore, there's just a kind of love of anything and everything in a way, including all the stuff that doesn't normally seem to be very spiritual or whatever. Yes, and I find it's like, it's possible to sort of fall in love with almost anything and with almost anyone in almost any moment. And of course, if you're going to fall in love with anything at any time and anyone, then it's quite important that you have a certain sort of center or ground of freeness. Otherwise, you get into a lot of trouble, constantly falling in love with anyone and anything. So I feel like, there's something about that in the essence of my practice this way, these days, just feeling that sort of ground of freeness, or that taste of freeness that runs through everything. And within the sort of safety net, in a way, of that, the fact that everything's sort of streaming through awareness. Nothing needs to be taken too personally. Nothing's worth grabbing onto. And then against that backdrop, just the sort of, the falling in love with the miracle of things. I mean, and that doesn't mean that everything needs to be lovely. Normally we think about falling in love with that which we like, that which we're attracted to. But there's something about falling in love with the fact that the sun rises. The fact that one breath follows another, the fact that one's heart is beating. Something about falling in love with just the fact that grass grows, And even the fact of falling in love with the fact of aging and illness and death and disagreement, and the fact that human beings can be, all of us, so stupid and petty, and that we can make up all kinds of conflicts and resentments, and that we do all kinds of awful things to each other and to the world around us, and all of that. And that might sound strange when I say falling in love with that. It's not to condone in any way. Well, no, one's heartbroken actually by violence and cruelty and all of that. And yet there's some way in which, oh yeah, even all our worst behavior is some kind of, wow, it's like this is human beings trying their best. And we're all trying our best, and yet we're trying our best through whatever kinds of obscurations and fears and neuroses and compulsions we have. And you look out at the world and you see the beauty of the world, and you see all the kindness and the love and the care we can show for each other. And then you also see the violence and the cruelty and the manipulation that we can sort of dump on each other. And there's this recognition that all of that is somehow just the texture of life. We're all trying our best, and mostly we're trying our best in a pretty clumsy way. And most of us are trying our best without any sense of what the inner compass of our heart is, or where to really aim at, or what actually that best would look like. It's like we're all longing for freeness without most of us having any sense of what that might actually be, or how that might actually taste, or how to even aim our hearts really in that direction.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Yeah.
A falling in love with the world is sort of the essence of my life these days.
That just sounds like such a good description of the sort of the feeling I might have, particularly after a retreat, of a sense of freedom, and then going back into the world and not really minding that it's very imperfect, and there's birth, old age, sickness, and death, as the Buddha said. The pain of those things suddenly seems really okay, or even beautiful. And then for me, it often fades a bit, even if I practice regularly. So it's coming back to it again and again without sort of getting attached to those glimpses of the freedom. Because I think that's certainly what I've done in the past, is like looking for freedom first in the wrong place. It is like freedom must be taking drugs and rebelling, or it must be doing whatever the hell I like, and then getting attached to these ideas of freedom. And then, of course, it doesn't work, and then I'm disappointed, bitterly disappointed sometimes. But how do you deal with the attachment to that maybe blissful falling in love stage? And then for most of us, inevitably, that goes up and down.
Yeah, well, any state, there is no state that is stable, right? So if you go on retreat, for example, or you any kind of intense experience, however intense it is, however amazing it is, the quality of the experience can't last. No experience can last, right? So if you've spent a week in silence and meditating 10 hours a day and chanting and eating purely, and of course then you're all shiny and bright and beautiful at the end of that, and then you come back into the dirt of the world, if you like, the intensity of the experience has to fade. So if you're relying on the feeling you have during a retreat or at the end of a retreat or whatever, then that has to be lost. So then what doesn't get lost? If the intensity of the state has to fade, the orientation doesn't need. The orientation is endlessly renewable, right? And so therefore, whether I'm feeling shiny and bright or whether I'm feeling dull and tired, all that's secondary, because the state I have is just that which is passing through awareness right now. It's just the shape or the form of experience right now. And yet the way I hold that state, that's where the sense of being in love with is. And that sense, so I prefer, like you, like everybody else, I prefer to feel shiny and bright, right? I prefer to be all kind of, light pouring out of my eyes and an obviously warm, radiant, loving heart and all the rest of it. But it ain't always like that, of course. And so, but more important than how I feel, or more important than what my mind state is, or more important than what I want or don't want, more important than whether I'm feeling peaceful or feeling agitated, it is how am I meeting that? Because the way I'm meeting, the willingness to meet that in a way that's sort of gentle and open and free and fluid, the willingness to meet in that way, and then the capacity to meet in that way is endlessly renewable. So first it has to be discovered, right? Because first all we've got is our mind state. And then when I change from feeling happy to sad, it's like everything changes. I was happy and now I'm sad. I felt really good after the retreat and now I feel all confused again.
Yeah.
So first we need to actually explore enough to realize that our state, the content of our experience, isn't that much of a big deal. It's not all we've got. Most people, that's all they've got. But when you really go deeply into the fact of being here, right? The fact that one's conscious, and then within the fundamental ground of being here, of being awake, of being conscious, there are these changing states. So once you establish yourself much more as the fundamental ground in which your states are changing, then you discover, oh, I'm not my thoughts. I'm not my states. I'm not my confusion. I'm not my sadness. I'm not my happiness either. What a relief to not have to be so responsible for all my stuff, you know? And then one finds that the way I can meet these changing states then, the attitude I can have towards them is endlessly renewable, because that which is aware of sadness isn't itself sad. That which is aware of agitation isn't itself agitated. And it's like that's where the space of real freeness of being opens up, in the possibility to be, on the one hand, really inside what's happening, really to be embodying this moment's sadness or this moment's happiness or this moment's agitation or whatever. One's really here with it. One's embodying it. One's inside it. And yet what you find is the more you're really awake to and inside of your experience, the more you find that within that there is the space to let it be felt and let it be known and let it move along and let yourself respond to it, but without holding it too tightly, without taking it too personally, and therefore without believing in too much in the content of your experience.
Yeah, I think that's so crucial for me, not to take myself too seriously as well. Like when I get sucked into the pain or the perceived pain of it all, what in Buddhism and yoga we would call samsara, I start to take it incredibly seriously, and it's a very claustrophobic place. And it often, for me, it becomes less embodied, because then I'm very in my thoughts and stories about it. And it might seem strange if people are new to embodiment, how sort of going deeper into it might create that sense of space, because sometimes all we want to do is like get away from it and turn the telly on or have some other distraction, which is sometimes the best we can do. Okay, it's that's quite normal. But could you say a bit more about going deeper into the embodiment of that, how that might actually create some space?
Yeah, because it's counterintuitive, right? The sense we have is people talk about, I need to get some space from that person or that issue or whatever. And we said in just a conventional way, I'm so tired this week, I can't wait for the weekend. I need to get some space from my life, or I need to get some space from work, or I'm really annoyed with my partner. I need to get some space from them. And understandably, right, because that's how it works in the outer realm, in the visual realm. If this is the problem, and you want to get some space from it, how do you get some space from a problem? You move away from it. And so it seems like surely that would be the same with the inner life, right? If I've got something that's uncomfortable here, I want to get some space from it. And a lot of meditative practices talk a lot about being spacious or getting space from, or even space around what's happening. And so the problem with that is that then we're trying to meditate and we're trying to get some space from experience. And sometimes that's reinforced by meditative language when people talk about, for example, just watch your breath or just observe your sensations. And so one has the sense then of sort of standing outside of one's experience and looking at it, and that sense of getting some space from it. But what easily happens if you're trying to get some space from something uncomfortable, whether that's physical discomfort or emotional discomfort or situational discomfort, that you end up, at least subtly, pushing against it. It's like, oh, I don't want that. I want to get space from it. In other words, I want to get away from it. And you find you're actually generating tension by resisting that seeming problem, that discomfort. You've made it into the problem that you're trying to get away from. And then you're just in the world of resistance and aversion, but you've just dressed it up in a nice spiritual language called, oh, I'm getting some space from what's happening.
And so transcending everything.
Yeah. And so it's counterintuitive because of that relationship to space. It's counterintuitive to actually, no, lean in, go closer, go inside. And so if we take the example of physical discomfort, I don't like it, and so I want to get away from it. I want to get some space from it, and so I'm resisting it. But that's actually making it worse, right? Because not only do I have the discomfort of the pain, I've now got the added discomfort of me sort of contracting around it, pushing against it, disliking it. So if I go into it, it's like, oh, that which at first seemed to be something solid, my legs that hurt, or my back pain, or whatever, or my sadness, or my fear, or whatever it is. And actually go into it, rather than it being a solid thing called my pain or my sadness. What actually happens when you come close, you go inside the sensations, you come in with a certain sensitivity and a certain curiosity, a certain willingness to suspend what you think you know about this and actually just feel it moment by moment. And what you find, for example, with physical pain is it's not the solid thing you thought it was. When you're just looking at it, it's, oh, my knee, my knee, my knee. And you keep repeating that to yourself, my poor knee. And then the more we relate to it like that, the more the knee seems like a real thing, a solid lump. And then actually you come inside and you find there's a sort of vortex of changing density, changing temperature, changing sensation. It's like it's a dance. And rather than finding a solid thing called my knee, when you come inside this vortex of changing temperature and sensation, inevitably you find space there. Because where are the sensations happening, right? It's not, if it was actually just a solid lump of something called my knee that hurts, you couldn't come inside that. But awareness can come inside any experience. And when awareness penetrates inside an experience, one of the central insights is there's space here inside it. And the second central insight is, oh, it's changing. It's not solid. When we say my pain, my knee, my sadness, they seem like things, like as if they actually exist as that. Yeah. When you come inside, oh, there's space and there's movement. And that means, that's the good news, right? If there's space, one can give as much attention to the space, at least, as to the experience. And if there's movement, that means it's not as fixed, it's not as intractable as I believed. And so then the invitation is, okay, hang in there with the space, hang in there in the movement, and without needing to draw any philosophical conclusions, what you can guarantee is if you come close, if you come inside your experience, including your difficult, painful experience, and if you attend to the space you find there and to the movement that you find there, then things will open up. and they'll open up in the direction of freeness. Even though you may pass through layers of fear or resistance or confusion, even though you keep bouncing away, you feel, oh yeah, I'm inside, there's space and there's movement, but then you get pulled back into your more usual thinking. Yeah, but it's still my knee and it still hurts and I still want it to stop. Oh yeah, okay. And and if it's too much, you just move. You don't need to torture yourself, but if it's not too much, go back inside, come back to the space, come back to the movement. And so then the sense of spaciousness in the midst of experience becomes just more real for you. And the sense of all experience being something that's fluid and changing and moving rather than something that's static and fixed, that becomes more real for you. And then you live in a world of space and movement rather than in a world of fixed experience.
Being stuck with something that you don't actually want to be stuck with. Yeah, as you were talking about, I was kind of doing it because I've got a little bit of a shoulder pain, and I was suddenly, oh great, I can practice this. So maybe listeners are experiencing something similar listening to you. It's like you're already transmitting some of these ideas, which is part of being an embodied teacher, I think, which I know that's how our students experience your work very much.
Yeah, great. I mean, that's the way to listen. Otherwise we just blah blah blah, nice ideas, and we can bat nice ideas back and forth to each other. But nice ideas aren't of a great deal of use to us unless we're actually listening with sort of all of our experience and applying it as we go. So thanks for the reminder. Maybe others, if they weren't paying attention in that way, you've reminded
an invitation to do that if listeners weren't. So I was thinking as well, you sort of talked about that just now a little bit. Sometimes it's a bit much, and we can go in and out. We might call that calibration or titration. I think David Treleaven calls it in trauma-sensitive mindfulness. So to make sure we're not torturing ourselves, but also particularly with something like a physical pain, we get sucked into it anyway. I find, like, particularly something like a toothache, it's not something I can easily get away from. So I might as well go into it. Sometimes with emotional stuff, there can be a bit more choice. Like, okay, I'll go into it a bit, and then I'll stop and have a cup of tea, as we would in England, and have another look next time. So there's always that element of kindness as well, isn't that? That's so important. I think you're conveying a lot of the curiosity, the falling in love with it, but also making sure we do that in a kind way. That's a huge element of embodiment, as well as the depth.
Yeah, and including the coming, even with something like a toothache, right? We can talk about the going into it, but that could be a bit relentless. It could be a bit relentless if you can't visit the dentist for another couple of days or a few weeks, and you've just got some idea, I've just got to go into it. Well, yes, but not constantly and not only. Then it just it wears you down. I mean, physical pain is debilitating, right? So sometimes you don't have any choice, but often you do. So, for example, with the toothache, you can also take some painkillers,
Yes.
And then you can also just do some wise distraction. So if you go into it all the time, you probably just get kind of ground down by it. Because even though you find space in there and if you find movement in there, you also sort of find intensity. And finding the intensity is good as a way to discover space and movement. But you don't want to turn that into a sort of orthodoxy. Oh, I've just got to go into it.
Yeah.
There's this saying in the tradition, short moments, many times. And I find just that so applicable to so many things, short moments, many times, because it just feels much more manageable. The idea that, you've got, especially people with chronic pain, right, or some ongoing health condition, the idea that you've just got to, sounds like Buddhist rhetoric or meditation rhetoric, you've just got to be with it. You've just got to go into it. You've just got to understand that it's all changing. That sort of can put an unhelpful amount of pressure on someone. So definitely, it's really helpful and potent and liberating to make time to lean in that way. But short moments. And it's also important to give yourself some means of respite from that. So whatever way you can also ameliorate the discomfort, whatever way you can also have some time when your attention is elsewhere, like the watching TV we mentioned earlier. There's a sort of Buddhist rhetoric that somehow seems to suggest that if you're not doing anything else that's productive, you kind of should be meditating. Yes. And anything else is sort of a bit substandard. No, watching TV, it can be a really skillful response to something. So spend a few minutes feeling your pain and then watch TV. Yeah. In other words, it's no point doing something, however skillful it might be, like meditating, it's no point doing something to the point of feeling ground down by it or overwhelmed by it. And once you're overwhelmed, you've lost your resources. You can't do anything helpful. So even with the example like a toothache, right, you could get bogged down. So you have to see what's the results. Can I go into it enough to recognize some space and some movement? And then if the result of that space and movement is that it actually transforms your relationship to the toothache in the moment, oh, wonderful. You might feel that it's actually helpful to just stay there, tracking the space and movement. But you equally might find, especially if you're quite new to practice, that you find a sense of space and movement and then, okay, but that's enough now. That's enough. Yeah. So it's important to step out. That's the titration piece, right? To step out before it becomes too much.
Yeah. Yeah, and then it's useful to recognize our own patterns of on my recent retreat, I talked to the teacher, and one of the first things he said when I was coming up with my issues, he said, I think you're trying to fix things you can't fix. Mm-hmm. So that's one of my patterns. Like if it was a toothache, I can't fix this until I can see the dentist. If we're too I've got to sort this out now forever and ever more, that can be a bit counterproductive.
Yeah, well, it's like the fight or flight thing, right? Some of us tend more towards the flight. I just want to get away from this. I just want to numb out. I just want to forget about it. I just want to distract myself. I just want to sort of try and magic it away in some ways. And then some of us are more on the fight thing. Right, I've got to solve this problem. I've got to understand it. I've got to fix it. I've got to get to the bottom of it, etc. Yeah, and they both...
Yeah,
go on.
Getting to the bottom is also... I think probably a lot of our listeners are, and embodiment people and meditators I know are depth junkies. So maybe a lot of us have this pattern. Like if I can go deep enough, then I can be free from it. If I can go deep into my unconscious and whatever, then I can become free or enlightened or whatever call it.
Yeah.
It might be a risk for the depth junkies amongst us as well.
Yeah, and what's deep enough? I mean, what does going deep mean? That's why, in a way, I was talking earlier on about this falling in love with the world. Because actually, sometimes the idea of depth and surface is a little unhelpful. Or because if you're trying to go deep, what that really means is you're trying to get somewhere else, and it is impossible to ever get somewhere else. There is no somewhere else. It's impossible to ever get anywhere it's impossible to ever be anywhere other than where you are. So if where you are doesn't feel deep enough, okay, stay at the surface. But stay at the surface really in a way that's wide awake and curious and caring. And then you'll find that what you thought was superficial, what you thought was somewhere that wasn't deep, it opens up. It opens up. The depth isn't somewhere else, all of time and all of space and all of dimensions and all of in the infinite depth that it could ever be available is only available right here, where you are. And so fall in love with the world, In other words, give a close and caring attention to this. Even if this seems very ordinary, even if this seems dull, even if this seems superficial, because what you're really looking for, what you really expect to find when you go deep isn't elsewhere, cannot be found in some mysterious place called depth. And it's here, it's here, it's here.
Very helpful reminder. And I think the other thing that sometimes I think meditators, and again generally probably anybody into personal development can be at risk of is certainly speaking about myself again is collecting lots of different practices. One of my Buddhist teachers calls it antidotes, like collecting them in the way that Imelda Marcos was collecting shoes, like all the different practices, retreats, therapies, special diets, whatever we're into. Buying all these online courses that you don't finish. So, what I've always really appreciated about your teaching is the simplicity, particularly when you guide practices and so on. So could you say a bit more about that, the need for simplicity and just being here? Not that it's always easy, but not seeking the depth by collecting.
Yeah. Simplicity is sort of deceptive somehow, right? Because like when we were just speaking a moment ago about, okay, there's no depth or there's no somewhere else, just got to be here. There's something very starkly true about that, but it's sort of difficult to face because if I just really acknowledge that truth just for a moment, even if I don't really believe it, if I just acknowledge the possibility of it, just to be here. What right here? Like here in this mind, in this body, in this life, in these thoughts? It's uncomfortable. Until we've really confronted ourselves, we tend to believe that the most intolerable place to be is here with me, And so there's something seductive about the idea of, this or that training, this or that practice, this or that teacher, this or that place, this or that possibility. And then we hear of other people and they've taken psychedelics in this it really did this for them. Or they went to this training and it really did this for them. And then it's so seductive, right? Oh, so it's there, the thing I want. And it's seductive to think that the right place or the right practice or the right person is over there because it relieves us of our responsibility, right, in the moment. I mean, it doesn't really, but that's the belief, or that's the hope. It's like, maybe I don't just have to be with myself as I am. Maybe I can go and do that thing with that person in that place and that'll do it for me. Mm-hmm. And on the one hand, it's sort of true. I mean, certain teachers and certain places and certain traditions and practices are really valuable and are really worth learning. And so, by all means, go and hang out with the teachers that you value, engage in practices that seem important. And then at some point, one has to see if you've found something that feels authentic and powerful to you, for goodness sake, just commit to it. Just commit to it. Like, just do it for, it doesn't have to be that long, but just do it sincerely for 10 years and then see. And I say it like that, just do it for 10 years, because of course to people often that would seem, what do you mean just do it for 10 years? That seems impossibly long. I'll do it for a month and then I'll go and find something else. When I have a meditation app in French, when I first created that app, the people that approached me to make the app asked me to make 365 meditations, one for each day of the year. And which seemed preposterous to me. I was like, well, how about I make one meditation and people do it 365 times?
Yeah.
It's a much better approach. And so, you know, I don't want to dismiss the value of hearing about something that seems, that speaks to you, and you think, oh yeah, that seems important for me, and I want to go and find out about that. And the value of taking on board practices and teachings and techniques and learning all of that. And yet, there's room for reflection, right? What's your motivation? Are you just adding another? Some people will do a training and then they feel, oh yeah, that was good, that training, but there's something lacking in their own inner confidence. And so they feel like, oh, but if I think I just need to do that training as well, and then I'll be ready. And then they do a second training, but it's not quite enough. Then they go off and do another training, you know. And some people are incredibly qualified, you know. They've got a lot of different trainings, but it's like how sincerely have you just given yourself to something? And you might think, people listening to this, people that are actually really inspiring, at least in my life, the people who have been most inspiring and most helpful to me personally, and not people who had a lot of impressive qualifications necessarily, but they're people who'd really like it, who'd really given themselves to something, and they did, you know, really deepened into it. And so here we are with this amazing, great range of teachings and practices available to us all over the place. And that's a good thing, right? That's an amazing thing. And yet you know, it's worth some caution that you're not just tracking around the aisles of the spiritual supermarket, filling your trolley with any old stuff.
Yeah. And I think the more I've done, and certainly bringing the embodiment angle in, it's kind of simplified it, that it's going in more detail into things, particularly the embodied experience of reality, but in quite simple ways. So on our training, we do have a few different meditations, maybe about 5 or 6 over 5-6 months. But it's generally about staying with one thing a while so you can get to that depth, so you can start seeing the detail, not just skimming the surface.
Right. And I think crucially, having the sense of one thing, you may well practice different meditations, for example, that have different ways of focusing, or different things you're cultivating, or different things you're exploring. But what's the one thing what's the thread that runs through them? And so, for example, that might be the thread of embodied presence. Mm. And if you're clear about the central feature of whatever you're practicing, if you're clear about, and it goes back to our very first question, right? What's the essence of your practice? If you're clear about the essence of your practice, then you can actually pick up or put down different approaches or different ways of experimenting with what you're doing or how you're practicing, without getting confused and without getting distracted and without getting diffuse, because it's all feeding the central feature. It's all about embodied presence, or it's all about what I was calling tracking the taste of freeness. Mm. And so that it's I think it was Suzuki Roshi, or one or other famous teacher, says the most important thing is to find out the most important thing. You know, so a lot of us are running around with no idea about what the most important thing is. And so if you can find that, what's of central importance to you? What are you really most interested in? What, same question again, is the essence of your practice? And then you just keep that alive. Keep that in the spotlight, and then you can use all the different resources and teachings and practices and supports that are there without getting lost in them.
Oh, that's a great sort of as we're moving towards the hour. That's actually a really great sort of final tip almost, to keep asking that. And the other one that I want to remember is awareness can penetrate anything. That's a good one for me to take away as well. It's such a pleasure to have almost like a one-to-one teaching with you. It's really, really great. Anything else you would like to say before we start to wrap up? Anything you've got coming up? I've mentioned our course, which you feature on with a couple of live sessions starting next week, 14th of March 2023. So you might be listening to this later. Hopefully it will be on again next year. But anything you've got coming up?
I've always got things coming up, but without getting too much into that, just to say, just appreciating the way you put the curriculum together for the Embodied Meditation course, and I just enjoyed kind of going along with you with that last year, and hope people can find it helpful again this year. One thing I've actually just started doing it in the last couple of days, but I've been doing some sort of live short video Q&As on Instagram. So I put up a thing where people can just ask me questions, and then I give these sort of little responses. And it's quite interesting. It's quite a direct way to do that. So, and it's also one way that people can easily ask me anything they feel like they might like to ask me. So I'm at Martin Aylward on Instagram, and that's one good way to connect with me. And then Sangha Live, which you mentioned at the beginning, I'm quite often teaching live there. I do a lot of live classes in the mornings, and they're completely free and accessible, and it's a really great platform. And if you don't want to sit with me, there's a whole bunch of other really good teachers that teach there as well. So that's worth checking out.
Yeah, most definitely worth checking out. And Martin also contributed to designing the Embodied Meditation course last year, and will be with us a little bit of the time. So as always, super grateful. You can find him on Instagram, and also, is it martinaylward.com? Your website?
Exactly, yeah.
And you can find out about the amazing retreat centre as well, which I've been to, so you can give an honest review. Very much worth visiting. So thank you very much for joining me, and I may have to listen to this one again, because there was a lot of stuff in there that I found very useful to hear.
Well, thank you, Karin. Always nice to talk to you too.
Mark Walsh here. If you like that, you'll probably like embodimentunlimited.com and our app. So on both of these things, you can get a bunch of podcasts that aren't available here, and some exclusive ones with some big names, some people you'll probably recognize that are over there. There's a copy of my book, PDF of my first book on embodiment, which seems to people like. Sold quite a few copies on Amazon, but there's a free copy there. What else is there? Loads of videos of me coaching embodiment, resources on trauma, on meditation, on yoga. And you can also chat to people without going on Facebook or any of that nonsense. So if you want to chat embodiment people, that's there. And it's on the embodimentunlimited.com, all free, and the app available at the App Store and all that good stuff. So if you like this, do check those out.